The French, like the English, are a racial cocktail. Ligurians, Iberians, Phoenicians, and Celts, just for a start, not to mention the 500-odd different tribes of ancient Gaul. Our story begins toward the end of the 2nd century BC, when the Romans conquered the southeast corner of what is now France, and made it their first province. To the French, their earliest important leader is Vercingetorix, whose name means either great warrior or king of great warriors. Seeing that the neighboring Gaul was, to quote Caesar's famous opening line, divided in 3 parts, the wily Romans decided to manipulate the perpetual tensions between the 3 mutually hostile tribes. Caesar always claimed that his reasons for the invasion of Gaul in 58 BC were primarily defensive and preemptive. The Roman province had suffered countless raids and several quite serious attacks from the Gallic tribes to the north, and he was determined to prevent any further trouble. This may have been partly true, and the war certainly enabled Rome to establish its natural frontier on the Rhine. But Caesar was, as we know, ambitious. The Rome Republic was rapidly becoming a dictatorship, with more and more power being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. If, as he hoped, he was ultimately to gather it all into his own, he would need an army, and a major campaign in Gaul would provide one. Though a number of their tribes had attained a moderate degree of civilization, the Gauls who opposed him were still essentially barbarians. Their ultimate defeat was probably due to the simple fact that their tribal society prevented them from achieving any degree of political unity. Largely for this reason, during the first half of the war, they produced no outstanding leaders. But early in 52 BC, when Caesar was away raising troops for Cisalpine Gaul, the 33-year-old Vercingetorix became chieftain of the Averni, who inhabited what is now Auvergne. The first step was to convince the Gauls that it was the Romans, not their own neighbors, who were the enemies. He proved an inspired strategist. Determined to force the Romans out at all cost, Vercingetorix set up a scorched earth policy. Every village that could afford food or shelter was destroyed. This guerrilla war, however, proved as costly to the inhabitants as the invaders. The tide turned when the tribes balked at torching the wealthy settlement of Avaricum, arguing that its natural defenses, it was built on a hillock and surrounded by marshland, would protect it. Vercingetorix reluctantly agreed, but was proved right when the Roman siege was successful. The following September at Alesia, Caesar won the deciding victory. Among the few survivors was their leader himself, who made his formal surrender on the following day. Vercingetorix, the chief spring of the war, put on his finest armor and fitted out his horse in its finest trappings before riding out of the gates. He then made a ceremonial turn around the enthroned Caesar, dismounted, threw off his armor, and remained quietly sitting at Caesar's feet until he was led away to prison. Vercingetorix was imprisoned for 5 years before being paraded as part of Caesar's triumph through the streets of Rome and finally meeting the customary death by strangulation. In the 19th century, thanks largely to Napoleon III, he was celebrated as the first of the great French nationalists. The war dragged on for another year or two, but after Alesia, Gaul became but after Alesia, Gaul became, to all intents and purposes, Roman. The Gauls, heaven knows, had little reason to love their conquerors. Caesar had treated them harshly, often cruelly, and had shown them little respect. He had looted and plundered without mercy, had seized their gold and silver, and had sold thousands of prisoners into slavery. But as the years went by, they began to see that there were, after all, compensations. Nothing unites people like a common enemy, and under Roman governorship they became united as never before. Their tribal system simply withered away. Within 50 years, the Gallic landscape was transformed, just as Provence had been the best part of a century before, with new roads, cities, country villas, theaters, public baths, and for the first time, properly plowed fields. Now, with a little effort, an educated Gaul might obtain Roman citizenship, with all the privileges that it entailed. Gaul was to remain Roman for some 500 years. By the beginning of the 2nd century, men had begun to talk of a new religion. Christianity spread slowly northward from the Mediterranean. By 100 AD, the first missionaries had reached Marseille. The Roman emperor, for an empire it had now become, was surprisingly relaxed where religion was concerned, so long as lip service was paid to the cult of the emperor. People were free to believe more or less what they liked. The Christians, however, were not prepared to go even that far. Persecution was therefore inevitable. It began under Nero in 64, after the Great Fire of Rome, and continued spasmodically for the next 250 years, reaching its darkest hour in the reign of Diocletian at the turn of the 3rd and 4th centuries. Martyrs were innumerable. But then came the dawn. In February 313, the two emperors, Constantine the Great and Licinius, published the Edict of Milan, which permanently established toleration for Christians throughout the empire. And 25 years later, though admittedly when on his deathbed, Constantine himself was baptized. By the beginning of the 5th century, the Roman Empire was on its last leg, almost defenseless against the barbarians, Goths, Huns, and Vandals, who swept down from the northeast, ever in search of warmer climates and more fertile lands. These were not invading armies. They were migrations of whole peoples. All they asked was somewhere to settle, and settle they did. The Huns, on the other hand, were Mongols and barbarians through and through. The leader of the Huns, Attila, within the space of a few years, and within the space of a few years he had made himself feared throughout Europe. These were the people who crossed the Rhine early in 451 and smashed their way through France as far as Orleans before being defeated. Had Attila continued his advance, French history might have been very different, but the situation was quite bad enough without him, as the whole machinery of the empire began to crumble. Even communications across the Alps were broken. Orders from Rome simply failed to arrive. The abdication in 476 of the last emperor of the West is no surprise. With the Roman Empire effectively gone, Gaul disintegrated into a mass of small barbarian states. Sooner or later, one state becomes stronger than the rest and ultimately achieves domination. This time, it was the Salian Franks. Relatively recent arrivals, they first appeared in the scene in the 2nd century, and over the next 300 years gradually merged with the Gallo-Roman populations, giving their name to modern France in the process. In the latter 4th century, their kingdom had been founded by a certain Childeric, son of Merovich, and was consequently known as the Merovingian. It was Childeric's son Clovis who became king of the Franks in 481, uniting as he did nearly all Gaul under Merovingian rule. Clovis has a serious claim to have been the first king of France. His name, in its later version of Louis, was to be given to 18 successors before the French monarchy ended.